So thank you for joining us here at the virtual Mark Twain Library. My name is Elaine Sanders, and I'm the coordinator of adult programming. Today, after receiving such a beautiful hint of spring's arrival, it is a joy to have the Reading Garden Club with us to talk about soundscape ecology. And now I'd like to hand things over to Nita Alarcon of the Reading Garden Club, and she's going to introduce this evening's program. So thank you, Nita.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming. And this is just another really wonderful evening that the Reading Garden Club and the Mark Twain Library are able to share with everybody in Reading, and we're really happy to do that. I want to shout out to Elaine for all the work that she's done on this, and also to Sandy Martin, who is one of our Garden Club members who put this together. And we've been really happy in being able to collaborate with the library during COVID and sharing all these programs with the community. And we'd love for you to check us out on Facebook and check us out on our website. We do a lot of things around Reading, and we're really proud of all those things we do. We've been doing this now since January, and we have a couple of more programs coming up. Next week on the 22nd, we have a program on hydrangeas. And on April 19th, we will be having a speaker come in and talk about deer-resistant plants. We're keeping our fingers crossed this year that we're going to be able to have our annual plant sale. And that will be on Mother's Day weekend on Saturday, May 8th, fingers crossed. And also our garden tour that we do every 2 or 3 years, and that's scheduled for June 12th, if all goes well with the programs. So with that, I'm really excited to see Cathy Smith's presentation for us tonight on soundscape ecology. Sounds really interesting. I love the soundscape that we had as you were entering tonight. So with that, I'm going to introduce Cathy and ask her to introduce herself and give us a little background on what she's doing. Thanks.
I will say again that I'm delighted to be here today. And I just stepped out the door just before I started tonight to see if I could hear those first spring peepers peeping. And alas, I did not. I think there's too much snow on some of our ponds. But I was happy to supply some of those sounds, and I think you could hear a few wood frogs in there too to kick us off and get us in the mood. I will say that in the chat function, if you do have questions, please put them in. And in addition to questions, I'm going to say that if you have heard any spring peepers or any other signs of spring life so far, just plug it into the chat. I'd love to see what you're hearing, if you're hearing anything. So I'm Cathy Smith. I hope that you're all comfortable, have a nice glass of wine or tea or whatever it is. And I hope that you'll enjoy the talk. So I'm going to talk about sounds, and specifically the idea of the soundscape and of how all of the sounds that surround us, including the sounds that we make, come together to create that soundscape. And I want to talk about why those sounds matter and why we should be not just hearing them, but listening to them a little more actively, and how that may actually impact not only our own lives, but the lives of the welfare of the world, in a sense, because it allows us to sort of reconnect with nature in a really substantial way. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the emerging science of soundscape ecology, which is really fascinating. And I will also give you a few hints about ways that you can actually help invite the voices of nature into your own yards, gardens, patios, whatever you have. So I do want to start just briefly saying that the reason that I'm here speaking to you is that I work with the Norwalk River Watershed Association and the Pollinator Pathway group. I'm also on the board of the Norwalk River Valley Trail, and I'm a longtime gardener, sort of amateur naturalist and birder. And I'll tell you in a few moments a little bit more about how I became particularly interested in sounds. Before I go any further, I just want to give a heads up, and I'll come back to this at the end, that there's this great organization called Frog Watch USA, and they do training every year or so to train people how to become sort of official frog watchers, and to learn how to recognize the sounds of frogs and toads. And there's a training coming up. It's on the 25th from 7 to 8:30 in the Maritime Aquarium. It has a sign up, but I'll come back to that at the end. So I just wanted to let you know about that. The Norwalk River Watershed Association is co-sponsoring that. Okay, so let's get started. I was really struck by this quote in a book called Erosion by an author I really love, who's a wonderful author who covers the natural world and is a conservationist. And this quote really grabbed me. I'll just read it. She notes that a chevron of geese will fly past our window, Canada geese. I hear them first and see them second. Sound shapes our perceptions in inexplicable ways. Our windows are always open and wildness enters our home. And what that made me think of too is, of course, sound does shape us in amazing ways. It has a lot to do with memory. We'll hear a snippet of sound and it can evoke amazing things. It also has a lot to do, as we'll see, and how you've, no doubt how you've experienced it. It can be very a good way to sort of relax yourself or calm yourself. You know, I was thinking the idea of our windows always being open. Let me go back there. Sorry. The windows always being open. You know, here it's not quite so easy. It is where Terry Tempest Williams lives. She lives in the Southwest somewhere, I believe. But it made me also think about opening our ears and our hearts to wildness and nature. And so that wildness will not only enter our homes, but actually enter our hearts and our minds and even our souls, and how that can actually have sort of an effect not only on us, but on how we respond to the natural world. So I come to this, I've been interested in the natural world for a long time, just in an amateur way. But I will say that there was a point in my life, which amazingly is documented by this photo, that I really trace a lot of that interest in the natural world to, and the sounds particularly. And I'm from Canada originally. We were in New Brunswick, sort of in a slightly remote cottage, and I got really sick with encephalitis. And my father, fortunately, was a doctor who gave me very good care. But when I recovered, a girl from a neighboring cottage brought this beautiful bullfrog to me to sort of help entice me back into the land of the living and sort of bring me back to life, as it were. And I just became fascinated by this frog and the sounds that it made. And I'm just going to play you just briefly. What you're going to hear first are the sounds of, there are some green frogs in there, but then there's this deep bellowing of the bullfrog that comes in. And I'm not intentionally not showing you videos because I want to focus. You can see a little bit in the corner there, but I want everyone to focus on the sounds that they're making. So sound, the sounds of nature have really had an impact on me. You know, I can think of all kinds of, I'm just going to quiet those guys for a minute. You know, examples in my own life where a memory. So for example, when I hear morning doves, still to this day, I remember lying in my bed in my bedroom as a child and hearing them cooing outside of my window in this big old pine tree and thinking that they were owls. You know, I can think of a trip my husband and I took years ago to the Great Dismal, and we drove through the Great Dismal Swamp, and I just heard this wall of sound that was spring peepers and other frogs. And, you know, the last thing, memory of sound particularly that's sort of special to me is that when we moved to Connecticut in 1999 from Toronto, it was just before the summer started. And although there are katydids up there, certainly, and cicadas, I had never heard anything like that summer. The sounds that we heard, we felt like we'd moved to the semi-tropics. It turned out that there was explosion of periodical cicadas. I won't go into that right now, and there weren't supposed to be, but it was so loud that I couldn't believe it. And I felt like in coming to Connecticut, I had entered this sort of new world of nature. So that's one of the reasons that I've become really interested in the sounds. And of course, you can't really talk about nature and the sounds of nature without talking about Rachel Carson. So I'm sure most of you know her, marine biologist, conservationist, ecologist, amazing writer. And she wrote a book called The Silent Spring that was published in 1962. And in it, she bemoans the loss of the dawn chorus that she had heard most of her life, and equates it to being the throb of life itself. And it was it was actually her observation of the sounds of nature, or actually the lack of sounds, that led her to focus on what was causing that, for the chorus of spring to be so quiet after so many years. And that eventually led to the banning of DDT in order to try to preserve songbirds, bald eagles, ospreys, many kinds of birds. So the study of sound and nature have converged, of course, forever. Sounds are an important emanation of the natural world. And I'm going to mention Brian Pijanowski again. He's a professor at Purdue who is, along with his mentor, who's Bernie Krause, who's kind of the father of soundscape ecology. They've done a lot of really interesting research on nature and the sounds of nature, and how they interact with each other and with us. And I think they feel strongly, and certainly I do too, that we evolved as human beings with the sounds of nature surrounding us. They're sort of embedded in our DNA and our souls, if you will. And the loss of those sounds is a real loss to us psychologically and emotionally, and that it enhances with the sounds that we're losing around us, and then the din that we make. It's actually sort of making that whole idea of nature deficit disorder worse. So when I started developing this talk, and I gave it, I think the first time about a year ago for the Norwalk Public Library, it was before COVID. And then COVID came along, and it seemed to make the relevance of this talk even more notable. I started noticing all kinds of headlines and articles about how people were hearing nature in a way that they hadn't for years. People in Paris, in New York, in Toronto, they were suddenly hearing nature because the sounds that were usually made, a lot of the machinery, the jets, the trucks, all kinds of things like that, were much, much quieter. And so it struck me, a lot of these stories talked about just the presence, or the noticing of sounds that people hadn't noticed before, but the fact that it was also causing, gave people a lot of solace, that these sounds and nature were continuing at this terrible time for humankind. So there's just a list of headlines there. I won't go through them all, but there's a great anecdote. If you see the third quote from Chris Watson, who's an amazing sound ecologist, he does the sound for David Attenborough's documentaries. And he was remarking that he had noticed that there was a blackbird in his yard. And blackbirds in England, if you're not familiar with them, are sort of like our robins. They fill that kind of niche sort of sonically. And he heard this blackbird in his backyard, and it was really a lot more vigorous, sort of stronger. He wasn't sure if it was louder, but he was sort of vocalizing more creatively than he normally did. At least this was Chris Watson's perception. And he felt that it had to do with the fact that with the sounds of humans and all that noise eliminated, this blackbird could now hear his competitors out there, the other male blackbirds, singing in a way he hadn't before. So he had to really up his game to attract the female blackbirds. And Chris Watson really felt that this had to do with the fact that he could hear more than he used to be able to hear. So, the last headline there referenced noise pollution. I've sort of alluded to it. That's a big issue that we often don't think of when we think of pollution. And there's an article that I read in the Atlantic about a year, I guess probably 2 years ago now or so. And in it, the author, Bianca Bosker, talks about the idea of the earliest noise complaint in history, and it goes way, way back there in the Epic of Gilgamesh from, I think that's about the second millennium BC. And in it, Gilgamesh is sort of the hero and a sort of legendary king. In any case, the gods decide that they want to get rid of humankind, and they decide to send a flood. And it turns out that the reason that they're doing that is because humans are so noisy, and they just can't stand the uproar that we make. So I guess when you get a noise complaint from the gods, the noise must be an issue, but it's hard to imagine what the noise would have been like then compared to now, and how much worse it is. And in fact, as you're probably not surprised to know, we are, as a species, getting louder. It's estimated that noise pollution doubles or even triples in the last 30 years. They haven't done a survey of sounds for a while, but one idea is that because the sirens of police cars and fire engines, ambulances are getting louder and louder, it's partly because the sounds that they have to overcome are so loud. So that's a good sense of how sound and noise is getting louder. It's also estimated that close to 150 million Americans are exposed to sound levels that are really beyond the recommended limits. And of course, not surprisingly, less affluent communities tend to be subject to more of that loud noise. I thought this was a really interesting map, and it's from the National Park Service. They have a sounds division, and this is a map that sort of shows a typical summer day, and it actually includes the sounds of the natural world and humans. And it gives you a sense of where the loudest and the quietest spots in the country are. The yellow being the loudest, and the dark blue being the quietest. And it's interesting, of course, to see that wide stretch of sort of mostly blue in the west, sort of beyond west of the Great Divide, and so much more noise and sound in the east. A lot of that also has to do, and we'll see another map related to this later, with the presence of moisture and water. Where there is moisture and water, there's usually more sound. But this really shows more the influence of the sounds and the loudness of the noise that humans make. So before we move on, I want to just sort of differentiate between sound and noise. And often, of course, they're used as synonyms, but really noise is a kind of sound. And there's different kinds of noise. It's not always the loudest, or that fact that it's loud, that it's a problem. There's all kinds of things. It's unwanted, inappropriate. It can be very competitive and chaotic. And one of the big things, of course, is when you can't control it. You can't shut it off. And also, quite often is the case, for example, with preferences in music, noise is in the ear of the beholder. So noise affects not only us, but it affects wildlife pretty deeply. There have been a lot of studies done about this. Certainly some of the research suggests that in noisier sort of industrial environments, for example, birds tend to reproduce less, and they have fewer offsprings than in quieter habitats. The noises they make can be screechier and louder and less sort of pleasant in a way. There is research that shows that stress hormones in elk and wolf droppings rise when snowmobiles come on the scene, and then diminish when those noises leave. There's a lot of research that's been done in the oceans, that the North Atlantic right whales react in a similar way to the traffic in the oceans. And I just read a statistic recently that said 90% of the sound in the oceans is actually generated by humans. That's a pretty amazing thought, isn't it? So it also decreases species diversity, bird populations, as we saw, even tree growth, which seems pretty amazing to me. And I just wanted to share one interesting anecdote about this. So Bernie Krause, the father, as I mentioned, of Soundscape Ecology, was out many years ago to record the sounds of, I think it was a spadefoot toad, which is actually a frog in Mono Lake in California. And they were out there recording in the spring, and the sound of those frogs, it was so loud, and they were all singing in unison. They were synchronized, and it sounded almost like one big frog. And then suddenly a jet flew over, and it turned out that the military was testing fighter jets overhead, and they made a really loud noise, and it caused the frogs to fall out of, to stop being synchronized. And so when the jets had passed, it took them about 45 minutes to get themselves back together and to be synchronized. And in that period of time, in this particular instance, they saw at least 2 great horned owls and a coyote come in to pick off the frogs, because now those predators could actually differentiate the individual frogs and were able to go in and actually successfully pick them out and take them off. And apparently that led to long-term impacts on the health and the numbers of frogs in that particular area. So, you know, birds and animals of all kinds are obviously not just making noise for their own pleasure. It's a very utilitarian thing that they're doing. And no doubt they get some pleasure. I can't help but believe themselves when they hear themselves sing. But I won't read this whole quote, but this is a really interesting article that I just discovered recently about sound sleuthing, helping to discover new bird species. And the article points out, of course, that the birds' calls and songs are vital for them to defend their territories, to reproduce, attract mates, and just to sort of hang together and stay close in their social relationships. So one has to wonder, you know, if they can't hear each other, what's happening to them. And this could be one of the reasons for populations declines. So we've seen a little bit about how sound affects animals. And let's talk for a moment about how noise affects people. And as you probably no surprise to most of you to hear that there's, you know, been quite a bit of research done on the impact of noise, and it can have all kinds of effects. And I mentioned this anecdote that at one point when I was preparing for this talk last year, I was sitting in this very spot, and across the street, our neighbors had a landscaping crew. And it felt like a full frontal sonic assault. And I was really noticing most of the things that I have listed here. My stress level was rising, my heart rate. I wasn't asleep, but, you know, I was having more difficulty paying attention, feeling uneasy. So there's all kinds of repercussions for us and as a result of the sound that we make, and we often aren't thinking about that. So the good news I would add is that it turns out that when we hear the sounds of nature, as I mentioned at the beginning, it can have a really healthy impact on us. All of these things that I've listed here, you know, pleasure, it helps relieve stress. I think it encourages mindfulness because you start to tune into the sounds. And it promotes this idea or this sense of biophilia, which the great biologist E.O. Wilson, who has written a lot about this, has written about. And biophilia is this idea that we as living creatures are actually just innately attracted to and want to connect with other living beings. So the sounds of nature are really something that we have evolved with and that really has a positive impact on us. And it turns out that not only does it have a positive impact on us and our health, but we can actually get a good sense of the health of our environment by listening for the sort of density and diversity of sound that's out there. The soundscape and the vibrancy of it is a great sort of proxy for biodiversity. So I had to add this one in. I was watching a documentary like a week or two ago about Miles Davis. And so In it, one of his childhood friends said that Miles would go out into the woods and listening to the animals or listening to the birds and play what he was hearing. So obviously Miles Davis was affected by many other things, but I couldn't help but think that the sounds of nature had a real influence on the beautiful music that he created. So I'm just going to pause for 1 second and invite you to just think about what sounds you might hear if you stepped out, or you will hear if you open your window or step out for a moment after this talk. Probably not a lot right now, but then you can start thinking about the sounds that you might hear as the spring advances, in the summer. There's lots of amazing sounds out there. And I would invite you not just to hear the sounds, but to listen. So listen is something that's actually more engaging and more active an activity than simply just hearing passively what's going on out there. So I'm just going to play this briefly. This little fellow, he's one that I've been hearing throughout the winter. You probably are familiar with him. This is a Carolina Wren. I'm just going to let him sing to us for a moment before I move on. You can also hear a cardinal in the background there. And, oh, sorry, let me get out of that and come back to this. Bear with me for 1 moment. And so, bear with me again here. Sorry about that. I'm having trouble advancing, but we'll get there. There we go. And it's not happening again. Sorry about that. All right, let me try one other thing. I'm gonna go to the next slide. Sorry about that, folks. Here we go. So back to the topic that we're here to talk about tonight, the sort of lead up to it. So we're going to talk about soundscape ecology, and soundscape ecology is the study of the sounds in the landscape. And it's not just the study of individual sounds, but it's really the study of the relationships between those sounds and between living organisms, both human and non-human, and sounds that come from the environment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. A quote that I love is that it's like the study of the narrative of place and the idea that the air thrums with stories. And it includes all kinds of things actually it turns out actually impact it. And we'll talk about a few of those now. And I just have this sense that if we all became amateur soundscape ecologists, we would all become better stewards of the natural world. So let's talk about what makes up a soundscape. So first of all, there's three components really. There's geophony, which are the non-biological natural sounds. So that would be wind and rain. It would be rocks falling, and the sound of an avalanche or the waves in an ocean. Biophony, which is the music of non-human organisms, and then anthrophony, which is the sound created by humans, by us. And I do want to separate that into two categories: pleasant sound and noise, as we talked about earlier, because obviously humans create very beautiful sounds as well as ones that are not so beautiful. So I'm going to focus mostly on a biophony tonight. So the sounds that the organisms and the natural living organisms in the natural world make. This just gives you just a general idea, obviously not near us, of a soundscape, and you can hear the sort of biophony, the geophony, or see it, I should say, and the sounds that humans are making. So one of the main categories of natural sound that I'm going to focus on are birds, of course. You can see a few of our sort of local denizens around here. And I'm not going to play too many sounds, but I am just going to briefly play a couple of them. So the first one you're going to hear is the sound of a bluebird. And then you're going to hear the rather eerie sound of a barred owl, the fellow on the lawnmower outside my window. And then I'm just going to play you the sound of the red-bellied woodpecker, who's the fellow in the sort of lower left there. So that's just an example of a few different kinds of sounds that from birds that you might hear in your own backyard. Of course, everybody I think is familiar with the sounds that chickadees and robins make. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to attract birds to your yards. And then we are going to talk a little bit about insects. And I've kind of divided insect sounds into two different types of sounds. There's insects that buzz. And those would be bees and flies and beetles. And I want to sort of focus your attention mostly on the native bees, the bumblebees, carpenter bees, mason bees, and those sorts of things. Honeybees, of course, make lovely sounds too. They're not a native bee. But just let me play this sound for you briefly. If anybody has squash blossoms, they'll probably, and you put your ear close to the sound of a bee and a squash blossom, this would be something that you would likely be to hear. And then, so we talked about insects that make buzzing sounds, and then there's this whole group of insects that chirp and trill. There's a name for that, which is called stridulation. I'm not going to play all of these guys, but you will probably be quite familiar with this one in mid to late summer, and even well into November, you can hear the katydid going. So I'm going to talk a bit about things we can do to invite them as well into our yards. And then frogs and toads. Sometimes we mistake the sounds of frogs for birds or for insects. We have a lot of native ones around us. I'm going to play just a couple of the ones that you might actually hear around now. I played you earlier the sound, you heard a lot of the sounds of the spring peepers. This would be the sound of a wood frog, and that's the lower right. They almost sound in a distance like a lot of really sort of frantic ducks. And you may start to hear soon the sounds of the gray wood frog, and that's the upper right. And they turn green when they're against leaves. And then you might also hear the sound soon of the American toad, which has this beautiful sort of trilling sound. And I'm going to leave it at that we have a green frog at the top and a pickerel frog in the middle, and they have their own interesting sounds as well. And then I'm going to move on and start to talk about how we can introduce them to our yards in a moment. Before I do that, I just want to add that that sound ecologist, Brian Pijanowski, really thinks that natural sound is a little bit like a canary in the coal mine, and that as we start to hear sounds decline around us, or that the diversity, the density of them, it could be a real critical sign of a real problem that we're having with climate change and pollution out there. And that's exactly what happened with Rachel Carson. So let's talk about how we can invite these wonderful creatures into our yard so that we can hear them. We're going to talk about planting. I like to say if you build it or plant it, they will come. Other things that we can do to bring them to our yards, to avoid things that harm them or kill them, to think about ways that we can reduce our sound print, and then ways that we can practice sort of more mindful listening. So the first thing I want to talk about is planting, and two things I want to say first. This caterpillar obviously probably doesn't make, well, actually, if you put a microphone up to it, probably makes some pretty impressive sounds. I include it there just because it's such a gorgeous creature. It was right outside my front door. Its parent is, I think it's the brown hooded owlet moth, and it's a little duller. But this guy doesn't make a lot of noise that you're likely to hear. The other thing I wanted to say is that if you are in the garden club, as many folks on this are, and you're interested in pollinators and are on the pollinator pathway, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to be really familiar to you. They go together really well. So first thing to say is that to entice these native creatures, think about going native with your plantings as well. And think about not just plants that offer nectar or food, but also our host plants. I mean, famously, everyone knows about the monarch butterfly and milkweeds, but many of our native insects and birds are really seeking out native plants for their nectar, their leaves, and for the berries and nuts that they offer. So really, they've evolved together, the plants and the animals and insects. So let's offer them food that they're familiar with and that will meet their needs. And then the idea of it when it comes to planting, diversifying. So think about planting a wide variety of shrubs and perennials and trees that are things that offer those fruits and nectar and host plants to a wide variety of different creatures. And also when you're thinking about diversity, think about diversifying in terms of when these things are available. So for example, if you had a wild azalea bush, they bloom really early, and some of those native bees will be really grateful to you that you have it set out. So think about what's blooming or going to seed or fruit when. Think about layering. Some creatures like to be in the leaf litter and the undergrowth. Others like to be high up in the trees. So think about perennials, the bushes in the middle level, and the trees. I mean, if you're a birder, you think about, for example, an ovenbird skulking in the leaf litter, or a scarlet tanager way up in the tops of the trees. They have preferences in terms of where they hang out. Another big one, I won't dwell on this, but this is a really huge thing, is to really think about reducing your lawns and open areas. So lawns, it turns out, are sort of like a green desert for animals. They don't offer any real food, or they don't offer any shelter. The way that so often they're achieved is through the use of chemicals, pesticides, insecticides, herbicides. So really think about ways that you can maybe cut back on your lawn a little bit and sort of increase areas where there is food and shelter for our native creatures. And then if you can choose a part of your property where you can plant fairly densely, you may not want to do this everywhere. Allow some growth to build up a little bit, maybe in the corners of your yards or up against a house, not too close, because of course you don't want to encourage too much damp or moisture up against shingles in your house, but think about planting densely as well. And I do want to add, if there is any question, that native plants are just so beautiful. So if anybody thinks that you're not going to get so much beauty by planting native plants, of course, I'm sure most people on this I'm preaching to the choir. There are just some really gorgeous native plants out there. The one in the upper right is a sort of a stand of mayapple in Shanks Island in Wilton, and a lower right is milkweed in my garden. And then the other two are actually in the native plant garden in the New York Botanical Garden. So in addition to planting, we want to think about adding other inducements to bring these creatures to our yards. And one of them is water. And that's a huge one. And it's huge not just for, as you might expect, toads and frogs, but for birds and all kinds of insects. So I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute, but think about adding containers or plates with water, bird baths. You know, if you don't have a pond, maybe consider if you'd like to build one. And if you have vernal ponds, those are those ponds that build up just in the spring, or wetlands on your property, maybe think about really being careful to protect them. I mentioned earlier sort of reducing the amount of lawn. So also along with that is providing more taller growth, more shelter. You can also think about creating things called toad abodes. I'm going to show you some pictures. There's bee hotels that attract the solitary native bees. Of course, nesting boxes and roosting pouches. And snags and piles in the corners of your yard can help bring more birds and insects into the yard. You can put out a bird feeder, and I think supplying little things that birds and dragonflies can perch on is a real inducement as well. I will say that if you're supplying water and bird feeders, you do have to make sure to keep them clean. That's really important for the welfare of the animals, of course. These are just some pictures from my yard and the ways that I've tried to add water to it. I started out in the upper right at one point with this big pot, sort of French metal pot, and I have a little bamboo spout in there. I ended up with, I think, 13 green frogs in there a couple of years ago. You wouldn't think looking at it. And then other frogs have made their way into the yard. Just some more examples of plates of water, a bird bath. There's a chipmunk eating out of a little tray that I put down. And I'm just going to ask people one thing. I used to have tons of chipmunks in my yard. And as of about late summer last year, they vanished. And I suspect it might be there's a mink that's hanging around my property. But if anybody is still seeing them, I would love to know, and you could enter that in chat if you're interested in doing that, because I'd love to know what's happened to my chipmunks. There's the pond that I actually decided to put in my yard. And I do want to say too that I mentioned earlier, the presence of water has a big impact on the presence of natural sounds. This map is a little different from the one we saw before. And it actually imagines a world without people. So this is just natural sounds. And you can see the loudness, the quietest places are the sort of brownish yellowish colors. And they're the deserts and the mountain tops. And then the dark blues are the loudest. And these, again, are natural sounds. It's really interesting to see here the Mississippi River, the Everglades in Florida. Even you can see here, if you can see my cursor, the Hudson River. So this is just more evidence that the presence of water really summons up natural sounds in the chorus of nature. A way to attract native bees, they're often called solitary bees, but in a way they're communal. They don't like hives, but they like to live in these sort of these bee houses that you can build. This is a sort of deluxe one, but you can create really simple ones and you can buy them. There are instructions on the Pollinator Pathway and Norwalk River Watershed website if you want to look those up. These are what we call toad abodes. They're also for frogs. Toads and frogs keep themselves moist, not by drinking, but absorbing water, and they need to stay moist. So on a hot day, it really helps to keep them not only protected from predators, but to be in a warm place. I mean, a damp place. This was a sort of toad abode that I set up. I found a sort of a wrap of bark that I put next to the pond, and it really seemed to attract the frogs. I really think, as I said earlier, this is my backyard last spring before I sort of started to clean it up too much, but you can see that I have a lot of little things that birds and dragonflies and other things can perch on. And then I want to talk briefly about what we need to sort of maybe stop doing, because these are things that can actually harm birds and insects and amphibians. And one of them is to reduce, or I would say eliminate, pesticides, herbicides, and even synthetic fertilizers. If you do that, you will have a lot more frogs, toads, insects that will actually take care of a lot of the pests in your yard. It's estimated that a frog, for example, will eat over 100 insects in a night and possibly up to 10,000 in a season. And they can take care of the frogs of a lot of other things like slugs as well. So keep an eye on pets. You know, they can be a little bit challenging for the wildlife out there. Cats, I love cats. I have a cat, but cats are estimated to kill between 1 billion and 3 or 4 billion songbirds a year. So just being careful of our pets. Minimize any disturbance of your backyard pond or wetlands. I think we said that before. And if you have a pond, don't put non-native frogs, toads, or fish in. They can not only eat the frogs and their eggs, but they also can carry something called the ranavirus, which is not so good for frogs. And then cut the lights. That's something I've really learned fairly recently, which is that a lot of bright lights at night, our house lights, can actually kill off a lot of insects over the course of a night, both by exhausting them or by making them really sort of stand out for predators. So these are just all things to think about as we think about living more in concert with nature. And then I would say reduce your sound print if you can. If you mow less, there's less noise. We talked about having less lawn, so you won't need to use that lawnmower quite as much. Consider non-gas powered machines. I personally don't have any. It's something I'd like to do at some point, but I believe that a gas powered lawnmower emanates about 90 decibels of sound, which is really loud, versus about 75 for an electric one. So there is a real difference there. Again, these are just ideas to think about. The leaf blower, maybe stop using it or not use it so much. It turns out leaves are some of the best fertilizer we can have. So why blow them off and cart them away? Let's keep them and help our gardens and our yards become healthier. And if you have a sound system, well, maybe just consider lowering it or maybe even getting rid of it. So I just want to conclude with the idea that if we can teach people to tune into the sounds of our soundscapes in nature, it's a good way maybe to help us preserve those beautiful sounds we like and eliminate the ones that we don't like so much. So one thing you might consider is a sort of mindfulness practice, maybe the idea of sort of focusing on what might be called your sound diet. And there's lots of things you can do. Maybe take a 20-minute period and just think that you're going to focus on some of the pleasant sounds you hear. And then maybe in the next period, you might focus on the ones that you don't like, and then think about what you might be able to do to increase the ones you like and decrease the ones you don't. There may well be something that you can do about that. Not going to stay on this slide, but it's a wonderful magazine called Emergence Magazine, and there was a great article recently called 5 Practices for Listening to the Language of Birds. It was really lovely, and one of the things that I liked about it is the idea that sort of concluding phrase there is that the sounds of birds in particular here, but they suffuse the author with the sense of belonging. And I quite often, if I've been away to a foreign country, I come home and I can hear our native birds singing, and it makes me feel more connected with my home. And then the idea of a sound walk. There was a acoustic ecologist and a Canadian composer named R. Murray Schafer who came up with the idea of taking a sound walk on a regular basis and actively listening to what you're hearing, and maybe trying to focus on specific kinds of sounds at a certain period. The idea is that making people more aware of the soundscapes and what you're hearing is actually probably going to be even more effective at curbing noise than any sound ordinances will. So I'm just going to wrap up by saying, you know, the world, I love this quote from Yeats, the world is full of magic things patiently waiting for our senses to grow sharper. So let's think about sharpening our own sense of hearing, Just going to play briefly this beautiful sound of the wood thrush, which we'll be hearing soon. It's just such a gorgeous, gorgeous sound. And so lastly, I want to encourage you to look up the name Bernie Krause. He wrote this wonderful book called The Great Animal Orchestra. Again, the sort of father of soundscape ecology. And if you get a chance, Google Bernie Krause and TED Talk. It's only about 14 minutes, and really it is one of the most engaging TED Talks I have ever heard. He's a truly great man. So just to recap, and I want to leave a few minutes for questions. Let's actively listen a little bit more. These are ways to encourage that chorus of nature to come into our yards. Think about planting native plants, minimizing your lawns, holding off on chemicals, adding water and shelter, thinking about ways to reduce your sound print, and then just encourage you to pause and listen again more deeply. I have sent a handout, I think Elaine sent it around earlier, which has these things, so I won't linger here. Lots of places to get lists for native plants, including the Pollinator Pathway site and the Norwalk River Watershed site. These are some great books that you might look for. And in addition to Bernie Krause, there's of course Doug Tallamy's books, Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope. Lots of other resources out there. Just Google soundscapes and you'll come up with some really amazing things. There's a great site that the National Park Service has called Natural Sounds that supplies all kinds of really interesting recordings and information about listening to sounds. And then, as I promised, I would end just again by reminding you that there is this Frog Watch training coming up on March 25th at 7 p.m. Maritime Aquarium is where you can sign up. And then the Woodcock Nature Center is doing a virtual wood workshop and toad abode making session. And that's this Saturday at 3 to 4 p.m. And you can sign up on Woodcock Nature website. And then I just want to thank you and let this little fellow thank you as well. So they're the spring peepers, and that's it for me. So